Welcome back. We have, as I said, the search committee chairs for Berkeley and Stanford EE and CS, so they will tell you exactly how to make your applications rise to the top of the hundreds that they're going to be looking at. And Moses is going to chair the panel, so take it away, Moses.
All right. Well, so we decided we'll gather a bunch of experts from Stanford and Berkeley to tell you all the secrets about creating a winning application. I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves and give a brief statement about what they think what really makes a winning application. So to start with, we have Kathy Yelick from Berkeley.
Right, so I'm Kathy Yelick from UC Berkeley, and Claire and I are both from Berkeley, so it's a single department, but we do have two separate search committees. I'm on the computer science side, and I'm actually the diversity and equity officer for the search, as opposed to the chair of the search, actually. But I do read a lot of applications because it's kind of across the area in terms of the and I've been in that position in the diversity and equity position for a few years in computer science, so I've seen a lot of applications come through. I think that certainly how you write your research statement is important, and how you put together your resume to really highlight the things that you want to get people to notice in terms of your publications and what's interesting about your research. So the publications are going to, they are what they are, right? Whatever publications you have. And so you certainly want to talk about, probably put them in a broader context so people understand why they're important as part of your research statement. But you also want to give the search committee the idea that you've been thinking more broadly beyond your thesis topic and why that's important and where it's going to go. So I think sometimes a research statement can look much too narrow. So I think you want to talk about why the area is important and speak to not just experts in the field, which is what you're used to kind of writing for when you're writing your papers. You need to speak to a broader, say, computer science or electrical engineering or both audience.
We also have Claire Tomlin from Berkeley.
Yeah, I'm Claire Tomlin, and I'm the chair of the EE side of Berkeley EEC's search committee this year. And I've been at Berkeley about 10 years. Before that, I was a professor here at Stanford for about 10 years. And I would say, and I've been chair of our search committee for a couple of years now. I think that in addition to what Kathy said, there's also some other things that I think are helpful. And one is to, if there's a place where you really feel like you're very interested in that school and you really feel like you could fit in, I would talk to some of the people there. I would contact the faculty, not necessarily faculty on the search committee, but faculty in your area, and just sort of tell them a little bit about yourself and that you're applying, and that I think that really helps. I think sending an email ahead of time, but also trying to sometimes it's difficult to visit, but meeting people at conferences to the schools that you're really interested in. That coupled with the application can puts a little bit more of a personal face on the application. So I think that there's some strategies to writing the research statement and everything, but I think that really kind of drawing attention to yourself and what you've done and what you're planning to do is really important. So that kind of personal connection is a way to do that ahead of time.
Next, we have Boris Murmann from Stanford.
Yeah, I'm Boris Murmann. I'm running the EE broad area search. And so a lot of the good nuggets have already been given out, so I'm trying to rephrase some of them in my own words. So when it comes to the research statements, especially for a broad search like the one I'm running, it has to be T-shaped. So we talk a lot about T-shaped education, T-shaped people at Stanford. It also applies to these research statements. They have to be broad. You have to make them accessible for the entire department. You have to say why your research is significant in a broader context and so on. But you also have to show some depth. You have to show in that statement that you can drill deep and sort of explain exactly what your contributions are to an expert. So it has to contain both. So don't think that it has to be just a shallow summary of your research. It should also be appealing to the experts. Now, the research statement is important. If it looks bad, that really limits your chances. But in my experience, the most important aspect of what you hand in is really the letters. And so making the best possible choice on letter writers, I think, is incredibly important. And I think we're going to get maybe to talk a little bit more about that and how to approach that. Beyond this, I can only echo that if there's a faculty member exactly in your area at the university where you're applying, you ought to be talking to them. There's actually no excuse for not doing this. You have to contact them, maybe set up a meeting at a conference. This is always very nice, especially if you are giving a talk at that conference. Make sure that person attends your talk. Chat a little bit about what's going on in the field. And so this person can become your champion within the department, and he can talk to the search committee and say, look, I've seen this applicant's talk. It's fantastic. This is great. We should consider her or him and so on. So I think these are sort of my 3 nuggets for now. I have maybe a few more later.
And finally, we have Kunle Olukotun from Stanford.
Hi, good to see everybody here. So I'm in both the electrical engineering and the CS departments, and I currently chairing the CS search for the first time. And the benefit of going last is most of the kind of key information has already been said, so I can just stop here. No, so, I think the key thing that I've seen serving on search committees over the years is that the excitement really does come from the subfield that is going to that you're working in, right? So those set of people have to get excited about your research, about you as a person, about what you've done. And so the key thing, of course, is before you ever send in your application, you've done your legwork, right? And your legwork means, of course, going to conferences, making the presentations, making sure that your name is out there and that the people who you want to recognize what you've accomplished are aware of the work that you've done, right? And so if you get up and you give a conference and you want to meet somebody, go up and introduce yourself, or have your advisor introduce you to them, and make sure that you get a few words. And don't miss the opportunity at Stanford to talk to the people in your area, right? You're right here. Some of you already reached out to me about meeting, and I encourage all of you to make sure that you find somebody here at Stanford who is working in your area, and make sure that you talk to them before you leave. So the key thing is exciting people in your area. You want them to be your advocate on the search committee, and different areas have different ways of doing things. Some areas are very organized. They kind of scour the whole set of candidates and decide who they want. Others are a little less organized, and they might have a bunch of candidates that might be considered. So that's all I have for the moment.
Okay. Well, we touched on actually a bunch of these issues also as part of Eric Pop's talk in the Q&A. I thought I'll also give this set of people, this committee, a chance to weigh in on some of these questions that came up during Eric's talk. So, we've talked about a bunch of things that make a winning application. Definitely paying attention to your research and teaching statements, making sure that you contact faculty in the area beforehand, do your homework, make sure you go and contact people at conferences, and also have strong letters. What really makes, is there anything you would add in terms of what really makes an application stand out? There's so many that you make that first pass on. What's causing you to set something aside and say, this is something we definitely should
Really the letters, right? The letters are what, so the statement that often gets bandied about, right? And, I don't want to speak out of turn, is, we want to see the best person in 5 years. Now, of course, recommenders know that, and maybe every year you get the best person in 5 years. But you want your recommenders to really talk about your strengths and you as a complete package, somebody who's taken a problem and codified it and worked not only the maybe theoretical aspects, but in fields like mine in computer architecture, done a bunch of implementation and experimental methodology that really sets you as a candidate apart from your peers.
Would any of you like to add to what's already been said?
Well, the way, so at Berkeley, our search committees are made up of, there's a professor from every field represented on the search committee. So when we get the applications, we assign, like each committee member has to go through and review the applications in his or her field. And there's overlap, and so there's, usually there are multiple people reviewing every folder. So the research statements, usually what you see is most people will read the research statement briefly. It's the people in your area. So the person on the search committee will go in and read it in detail, and they will take it and distribute it to the people in their group in the sort of same research area who are not on the search committee. So with that in mind, you have this sort of T approach, I guess. You want to grab people, so sort of say broadly what you do, but the people who are going to be reading the different pages of your research statement and go into it in detail are the people in your research area. And I think that's useful that's at least the way we do it at Berkeley, and I think it's useful to have that in mind when you're writing your research statement and you're preparing it, that it does really you need to show off why you are great in your area, but you also need to say maybe at the beginning, why your area is important, and briefly how you've contributed to that. So grab a broad audience, but then allow for the people who know the kind of area in depth, grab them as well.
Maybe one useful thing to know also is that the decisions are really not these instantaneous binary decisions, right, where someone would read your application and then say yay or nay or something. This can actually stretch over 2 months or so. When someone is reading the research statement and maybe consults a few colleagues to talk about you, well, have you met her at a conference? How was the talk? And so on. And so a lot of folders, when I'm monitoring our cases, they have a lot of ups and downs, and you need to survive all of these. And in the end, you may get invited. And this is actually why, in the end, having a T-shaped research statement is very important. Clearly, in the beginning, it's more important for the people who read the depth part. But in the end, everybody needs to agree, and then they will go to that research statement. And if it's poorly written, they say, man, this is not a good application. How come you're recommending that person in the first place? And so it really needs to sort of survive many different rounds and levels of discussion. So think about it with that in mind. So it's a little bit different from graduate admissions, where I think decisions are made a bit more quickly, at least as far as I can tell.
I think that maybe just the one thing I would add is that the research statement should show some level of passion for what you do. I was actually reading somebody's draft research statement for something a little bit different, but it was very factual. I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and I learned how to use this instrument, and I learned how to write software with this package or whatever. And I said, no, you've got to say, I am really excited about this problem that I've made some contributions to, and here's what some of the future problems are. So somehow, it's a professional statement, but it still has to somehow convey that you're really excited about what you're working on, because after all, you are going to be recruiting graduate students to work with you, and if you can't convey that excitement in your research statement, then there will be a question about, can you actually build a research group to work in the area?
Let me ask you a related question. Do you think the application materials need to be customized for the place that you're applying to, or the search that they've announced?
Yeah. I would say yes, in most cases, because it's not very hard to do.
And any tips on doing that?
Well, I think in particular the teaching statements. So the research statements, yeah, but the teaching statements, you should look through and see what courses the places that you're applying to, what courses they already teach. Because you're going to be asked about new courses that you would design and courses that you would, courses that exist already at the university that you would be interested in teaching. And so I think it really helps when we're reading the statements to see that the candidate has gone through and put the effort into looking and seeing what courses we offer and where, in reading those descriptions, where they think they can, what courses they would be interested in teaching and what courses they could add to what already exists. So that's one area where I really think it's important to customize. Even for the research statement, I mean, you're, in many cases, you're applying to a place that already has people in your area or close to your area. And I think, in addition to contacting those people, it's nice to be able to bring out, to perhaps mention in the research statement, the kind of connections that you could make. I don't think that's as necessary. For teaching, I think it's really important, but for research, you can also customize it a little bit too.
And to add to that, it's sort of, as you look at the set of people close to your area, think about what extra dimension you could bring to the faculty, right? So what is the piece that you see that is missing there that you would bring, and how you would complement the research activities already going on?
You'll also probably be applying to a wide range of places, and some of those may emphasize teaching even more than others do, right? So I think we've been talking, you've been hearing about kind of MIT, Berkeley, Stanford, and Carnegie kinds of places to apply, but you may also be applying to places where their main interest is in teaching, right? There's a lot of very small teaching schools. So in that case, you really do need to have it may have all the same raw material, but you really need to emphasize then your interest in teaching and things like that. Whereas it's just going to be somewhat different at a school that primarily sees themselves as a research institution. At Berkeley, we would like to say we value both of them, and now we also value diversity, which, as I said, we'll put. I'll say a little bit more about that in my talk later. But it's a question of balance, and even your cover letter, should be tailored to the place you're applying. So it make it sound like you would really you would complement the people who are there. I think that I don't think you probably do want to rewrite your research statement a lot, as Claire said, but just to give you a sense of what people on the other side are looking for, you may know a particular group of researchers in your area at, say, Berkeley or Stanford or whatever, but what they're looking for then is somebody who will be complementary to the people who they already have, right? They're not looking for somebody who looks exactly like the people they already have, because they have that represented. So that's the one thing that you may want to think about a little bit, is how would you complement and connect to the people that are there?
Let me turn to a different question. This came up earlier today, but I think we should talk about it too. Any thoughts on references? I know a lot of people are thinking about, should I get that 5th reference letter? Is 4 good enough? Is 3 good enough? Should all be from? I have 3 letters from my same institution. Should I really be going out and trying to get a letter from outside? Any thoughts on this? I know Boris was saving some thoughts for this.
Yeah, so I think, I'm not sure there's a general recipe, but I can maybe go through a few mistakes that some people tend to make. I think a classical mistake is to go for some famous person in your department who would write a letter, but that person may have no specific knowledge about what exactly you have done, and they just may write you a very short and relatively meaningless average letter that will actually work against you. No matter how famous that person is, could be a Nobel Prize winner, doesn't matter, it will work against you. So you really want to approach people who know specifically what you have done, who can talk about the independent way that you approached your research problem, and say things like, I've never seen a student think about it this way, and that student worked really independently, and so on. Someone who has worked with you and saw you develop for a number of years and who's willing to write about that specifically. That's the kind of letter that you need. And in the end, it doesn't almost doesn't matter how famous that person is or what their rank is. Clearly, most of your advisors, there will be someone in our department who knows them, and they would potentially follow up with phone calls and so on. But the letters need to be very specific. So don't make that mistake of going for someone famous who doesn't know you.
Can I also add to that? I think your advisor should know you very well and can write hopefully a very strong letter. If you're asking other people who may not know you quite as well, think about why you're asking that person for a letter and what they can say about you that maybe your advisor wouldn't say. So some people ask, should I have a letter from industry if you did an internship or something like that? So, that shouldn't be your kind of first letter if you're applying for academia, but if you think that that letter writer knows something about you that your advisor doesn't, then it's a great thing to do. But also prepare your letter writers. So they are busy people, as you heard about on the junior panel, and you could hear from all of us. And so if you give them suggestions of, I was hoping you could talk about the class project I did, my third year of grad school in your class that, remember, it turned into a publication, and here's the link to it, something like that. If you think a little bit about what you would like them to talk about, that will make their job much easier, and it'll probably make their letters much, much better.
Something that can also work, I've seen a few cases where that worked really well, is if you give a talk at a conference and that talk is very well received, and maybe there's a session chair who could talk about this, and maybe the session chair has also followed your research, read your paper, and maybe that person can provide some context on how your work fits in the bigger field and why it's relevant and so on. So if you know someone like that, that can also work very well. Or an editor of a journal or somebody like this.
So we had a couple of cases that I remember in the past few years where candidates would be very strategic about their letters in that they would actually go out and visit a place where there's somebody who's in their area that they felt could be a potential letter writer, maybe a year ahead of time, and then they would start discussions and sort of keep in contact, and that, I think it's more than just getting a letter, it's because of the collaboration, but then they would get a letter from that person. So I've seen letters saying, I really just met this candidate in the past year, but we've had these great conversations, and I'm really impressed with the way that she is working on this. So I think that there are ways to, to foster letter writers that you may not have thought of at your own institution. They may be in other places, but it's nice to have that broad, that support from a number of different areas or places.
So one thing that's come up consistently is the need to do more than just the application, do some legwork, maybe write to faculty in the area. How important is it to plug should you plug your application or have someone else plug your application? Any other tips on things that you could do? Claire, you mentioned, for example, some people might visit a year before to lay down the groundwork for either a collaboration or a letter down the line.
So Berkeley's deadline, let me just plug Berkeley. The deadline is a moving deadline. So we're starting to accept applications in a week or two, November 15th. And the actual deadline is January the 6th, 5th. I'll say 5th to be on the safe side. 5th, yeah. But so you don't have to do it a year ahead of time, but now is a time where we're sort of gearing up our search committee. So
yeah, typically what happens is your advisor plugs your application, right? Your advisor contacts the key people in your area at the institutions that you're interested in and says, I've got this really great PhD student, and she's done this great work. Make sure to look out for her folder, right? And or tell the person who's chairing the search to look at the folder. And so that's typically the best kind of plugging, and the most effective kind of plugging that I've seen, and that's worked several times where I've been alerted to a folder based on a message from the advisor.
But not all PhD advisors do that. You might want to talk with your advisor about, would you do this for me? Would you send an email to your colleagues? Because it's not something that some do, but some don't.
Yeah.
Sometimes your other letter writers can do that for you, or even your department chair. So I think a lot of times we have a process at Berkeley where we're going through the graduate students in the department each semester, and so part of the purpose of that is to identify the stars who, so that somebody like a department chair who may be contacted broadly for who are the best people graduating from your department then has a list of names. So if you feel that your advisor may not be the kind of person that's going to go out and contact people and advocate for you, you may want to, for example, if you meet with your other letter writers, go in and say, here's the list of schools that I'm thinking about applying to. That gives them kind of a heads up on how many letters you're going to have. Ask for their advice on the list. Do they know any people there? Because they can then contact people if they happen to know people at the university, especially in your area, then that can be another way of getting the word out that your application is coming.
Yeah, and also, as Claire mentioned, I mean, sometimes it does help to visit places that you're really interested in. I mean, if they actually see you, they talk to you, they know you, it's really real, and I think it has much more impact. And this is something that you can typically get your advisor or letter writers to help set up visits to places that strategically are chosen because you really think you might be a good fit for these places. Let me ask one more question, then I'll turn it over to the audience because I'm sure they have many questions they'd like to ask. We briefly discussed two-body issues, and I think what's relevant is maybe two people applying for academic positions. Any advice on how to negotiate that with the application process? It's a tough one.
It's really hard.
This is one of the biggest headaches of a search chair. That's why we don't want to talk about it. But no, I mean, we actively then work with other search chairs or with other departments. I mean, we're really trying.
Yeah.
If we want to hire somebody, we really want that person, it's going to happen, typically.
So,
We work really hard on these things. It
Yeah.
takes an extra
Right.
workload for you as a chair.
so I think the question is, do you link your applications when you're applying? And I've seen it work both ways. But I would say that you have, and if it may depend on whether or not you feel like you have equal chances at the places. If you don't, then it's probably better not to mention it. And they can't ask you, and you shouldn't answer questions about whether you're married or whether you've got a two-body problem or things like that, right? They are interviewing you to see whether or not they want to make an offer to you. And once you have even kind of a soft offer in hand, once they've decided that they're going to hire you, then they're going to work really hard to try to solve your two-body problem, because they make very few. Every department makes very few offers in a given year, and and the clock is ticking for them too. And so people are getting their offers, and if they've made a decision that you're getting one of their two or one or three offers or whatever it is, and even though they might feel like, oh, there's another 5 people we'd really like to make an offer to, if they don't do it in the right time window, they're going to lose those other 5 candidates. So once they've made an offer to you, they're going to work really hard. So I would say you don't always want to link them. This was a question that came up at Rising Stars 3 years ago, whatever, at MIT. And the dean happened to be there, and the dean said, you absolutely should tell people up front, because it's so hard for us to solve these problems that if the earlier we know about them, the earlier they can fix them. I don't think that's necessarily in your best interest. It's absolutely in their best interest, right? But, or our best interest, I should say, as all of us at search committees, but not necessarily in yours. And so, I have seen people that have gone out and submitted their 2 applications together and say, we are only interested in a university position in which we're both, which we both will get a job, and that will restrict sometimes where you're going to get interviewed, because once they see that and you've told them that in writing, then they can kind of use that as part of how they're evaluating the case. But I think you kind of have to decide, and part of it is also, would one of you be willing to take a non-academic job or take a postdoc, or so that it's a complicated personal decision as well as kind of a strategic one.
We had a success story from Berkeley just this past year of a couple who, they're both Berkeley PhD students, they both graduated, they interviewed, and they got double offers in many places. So I think they, Carnegie Mellon or Princeton? They went to CMU. CMU, yeah. Those were, I know they were choosing between Princeton and CMU.
Well, on that note, let me throw the floor open to questions from the audience.
I was wondering, how do committees look at the previous work versus proposed work? Do they need to be similar, or they're not identical? And is it more important that you have stronger work behind you, or a really exciting proposal?
So the question was about previous work versus proposed work. How do you weigh the two?
Well, I think that you will be largely judged on what you've done so far. I mean, I believe that. I think that committees do, and universities want to see an exciting proposal because that's who you're going to be. But they are also going to judge your proposal and the strength of your proposal based on what you've achieved so far. So both are important. I would say that I would probably put more weight on what you've done so far.
So, just to add a little more to that, I mean, so I think you're going to be you're going to get the interview based on what you've done so far. But once you actually are in the interview session, there'll be a lot of people evaluating, what is your potential, and so the vision that you kind of create about where you're going and the excitement that you feel for that particular direction is what's going to convince people, especially people outside your field, that you'd be somebody they want to have in their department.
And you asked about whether you should, if your proposed work is very different than the current work you've done. I think, frankly, that's a little risky when you're writing a job application. I think you want to try to somehow make the case that you are well positioned to do that other work, and that it's, it shouldn't be just, because the other extreme is there were 3 things I really wish I'd had time to do in my PhD thesis and I don't, so I'm going to put them down for my future work. That doesn't look very good either. But if you are going to do something, you have to think about what risk they're taking on, which is, oh, here's somebody who's going to move into a different field and we don't know whether or not they're going to do it. That might be a good time to think about doing a postdoc so that you could get some experience working in that other field, and that would be a much easier thing to do. But I would say if you're going to do that and it's not too far away from the work that you've done, just try to make sure there's a connection. So you say, obviously I have the skills to work in this new area.
So I think one of the biggest fears of a department is to hire someone who will continue to work on their PhD thesis for N years. So you definitely need to show interest in interesting deviations and so on. But I fully agree with Kunle. This is actually much more important when you show up to the interview.
Back there and then here.
How far into the future should your proposed work be looking at? Like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
Yes, all of the.
The question was, how far in the future should your work be looking at? 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, I think it's important to have multiple timelines. Like, where do you see it in 2 years? Where do you see it in 5 years? Where do you see it in 10 years? Beyond 10 years, it's hard, but I think that 2, 5, and 10 is a good, it's good to think about all 3 of those time horizons. 5 years is kind of like the 10-year mark, right? Or a little bit after that. So 10 years is beyond that. So 2 years is kind of getting your group up, and what initial projects are you gonna bring in? Are you gonna give to your new graduate students?
I wanted to ask if you have any advice for people who are like multidisciplinary, but let's say like under CS or E, but still within a bunch of different fields, how to impress people from different areas. Would you now have applications that are pie-shaped rather than T-shaped? Something that I'm struggling with is when I'm trying to impress people from different backgrounds, I end up writing a research statement that's long. How important is keeping the statement short in these cases?
So the question is about the challenges of writing an interdisciplinary research statement and the need to satisfy different groups of people and manage the length.
So I do interdisciplinary work myself, and I think that you still want to kind of have enough of a T-shape that you are viewed as an electrical engineer or a computer scientist or whatever, right? If you kind of look like you're just working on lots of interdisciplinary problems, it can be difficult for them to figure out whether you would fit in, for example, a department. So I think that the way I think about it is that interdisciplinary work is showing impact of the things that I'm doing in my kind of core discipline. And so in that way, I wouldn't go into the same level of detail into all of those things all those other areas. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that. One would be computational biology, because computational biology, for whatever reason, is one of the sciences that's kind of considered to be part of computer science a little bit more than other computational science disciplines. And there are probably other examples of that in electrical engineering that I'm not thinking of right now. But anyway, that's, but for the most part, I would say you still want to look like you're a really great ECS person first, and that you have the ability to have impact on all these other disciplines.
Yeah, I think I would second that. I mean, you have to declare what your core is one way or another. And then you can say, well, but I'm interdisciplinary in the sense that I'm building bridges to some other areas.
But there's some gray areas, right? Like one of the interdisciplinary areas we have between the EE and CS division at Berkeley is this Berkeley AI Research Lab, and that is huge. And it's really interdisciplinary, and that's great. And so, you know, our committees are all interdisciplinary. The people who review the candidates are interdisciplinary. So
But you're referring to interdisciplinary between EE and CS.
between EE, CS.
I think, but maybe robotics is another great example, which could be interdisciplinary with mechanical engineering even, so that, yeah. I think some of those areas, it's well understood that you want people who have those skills.
There's a question back there.
So I have a question regarding coursework, stating coursework in the teaching statement, as you had mentioned earlier, like going into to learn about what coursework already exists. Sometimes our particular coursework's already taught by a specific professor, because in the presentation by Eric Koch, one of the things he mentioned is a course had been taught for, so many years by a specific professor, and then an applicant mentioning that they want to teach that course. So kind of what is the balance between wanting to teach a course that someone already has, a track record, and that's the course they developed, and, how do you kind of balance?
How should the teaching statement interact with courses that are currently present and taught?
Well, we will want you to teach that so that it finally gets updated.
Yeah.
So
That's exactly what I would have said.
don't worry about that. Don't worry about.
Yeah.
You're going to do a much better job. Yeah.
Well, but, okay, so I completely agree. On the other hand, it is a balance question that we look for in hiring. We are looking for people who can fill certain parts of our research activity, but also fill certain parts of our teaching program. And so I don't think there's any problem saying you want to teach a course that somebody else has been teaching for many years. If there are a lot of people teaching that course in that department, that's not going to be an advantage for you, right? So if you can say that just say there's another course that you would like to create that you think is really important for the students to see because it's complementary in some way, you want to make sure that you've got some diversity in there too.
I've seen 2 hands go up in the front, so maybe I'll give you guys a chance to ask your questions. One. Yeah.
Do you evaluate differently candidates that are PhD students versus postdocs, or maybe a postdoc that gets started? Is it similar to a PhD student? Is the bar different?
Is the bar different for graduating fresh PhDs versus postdocs?
We try to make it different, right? We try to adjust for what level you're at, because it's very unfair to evaluate a fresh PhD with somebody who maybe is already an assistant professor or something like that. But it's very hard mentally to make those adjustments sometimes, but we try.
Yeah. We certainly do. And, it's even more difficult in this year's CS search because we're looking at people potentially that have already been tenured. But presumably they'll be in a different pool.
Well, we have, right now we have 4 positions in EECS at Berkeley, but there's quite a few more than that, actually. So 4+, I think, is how I would describe it. One of them is for tenured, and 3 of them are for assistant professor level. Yeah. But it's one search, so we bring in everybody in that search. And we really do, we discuss this all the time in our committee meetings, I hope we tend to favor the more junior people. Yeah. But we have to remind ourselves to doing that.
Yeah. I mean, everybody says, and this is the mantra that's, been, repeated since I've was an assistant professor, is that everybody wants, you to come in and do your best work at their institution, right? They don't necessarily want you to go prove yourself somewhere else and then go poach you, right? Because potentially then they're not known for growing young faculty, which is what we all pride ourselves as being good at. And so that's the goal. And so we really do strive to balance the fact that, fresh PhD isn't going to have an accomplished, publication record, not be as well known, but may have far greater potential than somebody who's more senior.
Any question?
If you're in a situation where your research requires equipment that's extremely expensive, like unusually expensive, is it better to is it better to write like a broader statement saying how you could do maybe research in other areas using the shared facilities that are already there? Or is it better to write like, ideally this would be the case that I could do, but here's like a smaller scale plan, or just schools that you think are willing to support that system type of thing?
So how about research that needs an unusually large amount of resources? How should you address these kinds of questions?
I mean, it's kind of like maybe the two-body question. At this point, when you're writing your application, you're selling yourself, so I would not be too narrow about what you're going to want after they've made you an offer, right? And so the fact that so to include it is fine, that what kind of grand vision you have, but I would think you want to be a little bit more, it might just narrow your search too much if you only are going to apply to places that could either afford to or already have the equipment.
But you don't really have to put that in your application, right? That's something, if you get the offer, that's something that you'd start negotiating.
If all of your previous, so I'm in molecular beam of the taxi, and if all your previous research is either with that field or with a low temperature measurement system, you're going to realize, I think, that you require, you could do something else, but your experience isn't that.
Then you write your research statement that this is what you want to do and this is what you want to achieve, and the departments will figure it out, and they'll have some equipment, and they'll probably ask you about that. They might ask you in your interview, but I would probably tend to talk about what you want to do with it. Talk about your goals and the kind of, the 2-year, 5-year, 10-year things you want to do, and bring the excitement with that, and then they'll find the money if they, that's kind of the way it works. But I wouldn't put, like, I need this piece of equipment. Yeah.
And if there are shared facilities that you can point to, I think that is a good thing to put in your statement, even though later you're going to come back and say, and by the way, now I really want $1 million for this piece of equipment.
You had a question?
Yeah. To what extent do you notice or hear about a candidate's past experience mentoring undergraduate and graduate students? And if it is something you care about, where is the best place to convey that in an application?
So the question was, how much does mentoring graduate and undergraduate students play a role in your evaluation of a candidate?
Usually we care a lot, and that's put in multiple places. So you can put it on your CV and your teaching piece, so it highlights. You can talk about it in your research statement. If that mentoring was part of your, mentoring them, they sort of came in and they worked with you on part of the research. And you can put it in your teaching statement. You can have a paragraph on mentoring. So that's what I would recommend for that. And it can also go in your diversity statement. We have, I think Kathy's going to talk about this, but at UC Berkeley we have a website that points you to things samples for your diversity statement, and that's definitely one of the things to include.
And as already was mentioned, you can also remind your letter writers to talk about that if there was a specifically successful outcome or something like this. It looks good in a letter.
Or if somebody else is first author in the paper, but they were an undergraduate and it was the right thing, then you want to make sure you explain that at some point. That, you mentored them and you felt, it was the right opportunity. I mean, that's a great sort of thing to put in your teaching statement.
A couple of questions, one here and one here. So,
how much person doesn't have much teaching experience? For example, TA 2 courses, and I'm going to be teaching a course in the spring.
That's kind of a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah, typical.
It's enough.
I'm in an applied math department in President, and they teach 3 courses a year. So.
Yeah. No, that is probably more than a lot of people have. Yeah.
This is also related to teaching. One of the research universities said in their application that they wanted at least 2 references to talk about teaching ability. Is that an implicit requirement in other top research universities also, or was that?
I would say no, it's not expected in other research universities. It is something that, going back to the kind of junior-senior thing, when we're recruiting people that are more senior, then we try to get teaching letters of some letters that can talk about that, because it's kind of otherwise it's a little bit risky to bring in somebody that's pretty senior if you're not really sure whether they can teach. But if they, but I wouldn't say that it's expected otherwise. I wouldn't use your letters that way, I guess I would say.
But some people do. Some people
Really?
do. Like some people we have 3 to 5 references, and
If you've got 5,
if you've got 5, you can actually say, suppose you've, the kind of only interaction you've had with a professor is that you were the graduate student instructor in a course that she or he taught, then, and you felt like it was a really good experience, and, that might be a good reference.
And also you can broaden it, right, as this, teaching is part of communication, right? So how well do you communicate, right, in, situations where you've got to give a talk. And so, many of your recommenders could speak to that, right, and talk about, based on, a great presentation, I'm sure she'll be a good teacher, right? So that's typical.
Okay. Well, we're right at 1:30, so I want to take this opportunity to thank all our panelists for taking the time to come here.